Hello and welcome. This is Kevin Doyle. I'm the Executive Director for the Career Development Office at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and also connected to the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. And we'd like to welcome all of you to today's webinar about clean energy industry trends for 2020. We're thrilled to have with us representatives from big organizations that oversee and look into industry trends in solar, in wind, in energy efficiency, and also an overview of what's happening in state governments and on the employment side through the most recent edition of the United States Energy and Employment Report. So we're really glad to have them here. I'm not going to spend too much time with other things so we can get right to it, but I do want to send you a couple of interesting announcements. The first one is the slide you're looking at right now about financing and deploying clean energy, an online certificate program that we have here at Yale through the Center of Business and the Environment. It's a really outstanding opportunity for passionate professionals who want to advance their careers. These are people who are current practitioners participating in the program, and we want to spread the word as widely as possible. We had a really good inaugural year of the program. We think it's pretty fantastic, and we urge everyone to notice this deadline. Apply by March 1st, 2020. If you have any interest in it or want to talk to us, the communication is there of how to contact the certificate program and take on board that deadline of March 1st. We also want you to know that this is not our first foray into clean energy careers, clean energy trends, etc. We have a downloadable guide about pathways to careers in clean energy that is used here at Yale and for our current students, but we make it available to all other people who are interested in it. And I think you might find it to be very useful, and you can see how to download it online. And then finally, I want to let you know that this is one of a series of webinars about clean energy industry trends for 2020 that we're doing. Today is a broad overview of, as I mentioned, solar, wind, energy efficiency, and employment, and also things going on in state policy. But on March 3rd, we'll have one about a very important topic for clean energy employers, improving diversity and inclusion. And then on April 7th, we'll be highlighting some of the Yale School of Forestry and Yale CBAE alumni, as well as people from the School of Management here at the university who are doing amazing work in clean energy, and we'll highlight some of them talking about their careers and their sense of where things are going. But without further ado, I'd like to switch over and ask that John Hensley, Vice President of Research and Analytics at the American Wind Energy Association, get us started with an overview of some trends going on for 2020 in the US wind energy industry. And John, when you're ready for me to forward a slide, just say next slide.
Sounds good, Kevin. First of all, thanks for the invite. Appreciate being asked to sort of provide an update on what's happening in the U.S. wind industry. For those that don't know my background at all, I've been with AWEA for about 7 years now. We're the national trade association for the U.S. wind energy industry. We represent close to 1,000 members, over 110,000 jobs across the country, and we advocate on behalf of the U.S. wind industry, both at the federal and state and regional levels. So if we jump to the next slide, what I hope to do today is just to provide a general overview of kind of the key trends that are happening in the U.S. wind energy industry, as well as highlight some of the benefits that the industry provides to communities as well as the broader U.S. economy. So first up here, this provides some historical perspective for what's happened in the wind industry over the past 2 decades. The industry really got started back in the 1980s with wind development out in California, which was the first major wind market in the world. But most of the large-scale development didn't start to happen until kind of the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s. And then over the last 5 or 6 years, the industry's been on a real steady growth trend. We're now at over 105,000 megawatts of wind energy that are deployed across the country. To give some perspective, that's about 60,000 wind turbines, and those turbines are operating in 41 different states, as well as the territories of Puerto Rico and Guam. To give you some perspective on how much energy that 105 gigawatts of wind is able to provide, it's roughly equivalent to the amount of energy that 32 million American homes consume each year. So fairly substantial in terms of the amount of power that's being generated. In fact, at the moment, we're just over 7% of total U.S. electricity generation, so becoming a very major part of the U.S. generation mix. If you jump to the next slide, I want to give a little perspective on where the wind is actually deployed across the country and provide some updates on trends that we've seen happening. So we just closed our books for 2019, and during the year, we actually had our third strongest year of wind capacity deployment ever. The only 2 years that were greater were 2009 and 2012. For the year, the industry deployed over 9 gigawatts of new wind generating capacity on the grid, and that spread across 55 different projects in 19 states. So I mentioned earlier that we've got projects in 41 states. In 2019 alone, we deployed wind in nearly half of those states that already have wind power. So continuing to be a fairly diverse industry across the country in terms of where this wind is being deployed. However, there are some industry leaders when it comes to where the wind is actually built. Texas and Iowa generally are top of that list, and they were so again in 2019. In fact, these states both had record years for the total amount of wind that was added. In Texas, we saw more than 4 gigawatts of new wind installed, and up in Iowa, we saw 1.7 gigawatts of wind installed. Again, those are records for those states. Illinois, South Dakota, and Kansas rounded out the top 5 in terms of new wind power deployed for the year 2019. And then, of course, you can see a breakdown of the top states by total cumulative installed wind power across the country. We like to do state rankings just to invite some competition, and it's quite interesting to see how different states are moving forward on greening their electricity mix. Iowa and Oklahoma have been kind of tied in this neck-and-neck battle over the past couple of years for second and third place. Illinois has continued to move up the charts and is currently in 6th place. And then North Dakota, which has been relatively new to the wind scene, has grown very quickly and has now moved past Oregon for the 9th spot in our ranking. So it's quite interesting to see those states really embracing wind and moving forward with wind development. In total, we've got 19 states that have over a gigawatt, what we dub our gigawatt club of installed wind. So, great to see those states moving forward with their leadership as well. Jumping to the next slide, 105 gigawatts of total wind capacity installed, and there's a heck of a lot more on the way. We're currently tracking more than 44 gigawatts of wind projects that are either under construction or in very advanced stages of development. These are projects where there's contracts for the wind power, or they've placed an order for the equipment used at the site, or a utility, which is generally the largest buyer of wind power, has announced that they're going to move forward with a project. In total, there are more than 200 wind projects that are currently underway across the country, and this pipeline has been growing over the past couple of years, despite hitting records in each of the past 3 or 4 years. The pipeline by the end of 2019 was actually up 24% year over year, thanks to continued strong demand for wind. Now, in a bit, I'll talk about some of the economic impacts that wind projects bring to the country. But just to give you a kind of a sneak peek, the 44 gigawatts you see here that are under construction or advanced development represent more than $62 billion of investment. So certainly no small industry. And again, here in a few slides, I will also highlight some of the drivers that we see that's really propelling this growth. And those include things like renewable portfolio standards, cost declines, consumer demand, especially from commercial and industrial customers, utility demand, the tax credits that are in place, as well as the growing offshore wind industry and targets that states are setting in that space. Jumping to the next slide, we'll focus specifically on the offshore wind market. This is kind of a new, exciting segment of the industry, not only for the association, but for the industry writ large. The offshore wind market is really a nascent wind market. There's currently only one project that is online and operational, and that's a fixed turbine 30 megawatt project off the coast of Rhode Island, just off Block Island. That was installed back in 2016. However, there's a lot more offshore wind to come. And this is being primarily driven by leadership at the state level. We're really seeing states driving demand for offshore wind. Currently, there are targets for over 25 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity that has been set either through legislation, conditional targets, or executive orders. And most of these targets have set a deadline by at least 2035 to have this offshore wind in the water and operational. We actually saw that 2019 was a big year for these announcements. More than 16 gigawatts of new targets were set in 2019 alone, including an executive order in the fourth quarter by New Jersey Governor Murphy to increase their target to 7.5 gigawatts by 2035. We also saw a number of states move quickly forward on trying to meet their target. We saw both Massachusetts and Connecticut select a combined 1.6 gigawatts of offshore wind projects in the fourth quarter to help them fulfill their targets. So we're seeing a lot of activity in the offshore wind space, and this is translating to actual real projects that are moving forward. You can see in the chart here a number of wind projects, including the Vineyard Wind Project, which is expected to be the first large-scale offshore wind project to come online in the U.S. at 800 megawatts off the coast of Massachusetts. But you can see a number of other projects there as well that have either been selected through the solicitation process or have a power purchase agreement in place. So it's pretty exciting to see these advancements in the offshore wind space, and there's a lot more to come in the coming months and years. All right, jumping to the next slide, I want to hit on a few of those demand drivers that we talked about earlier. And one of them is really consumers, both at the utility level as well as non-utility entities that are driving demand for wind energy. The utilities have been historical buyers of wind power. They're looking to add this to their portfolio mix and serve their customers with the desired portfolio of resources that their consumers are demanding. And more we're seeing that those consumers are demanding renewable energy, including wind, and utilities in a lot of places are responding to that and going out and procuring wind. So we see demand from that segment continuing to grow. We've also, over the last couple of years, have seen increased demand and interest from commercial and industrial customers. So think of your Fortune 500 companies that are trying to build their sustainability programs and are looking to increasingly power their businesses with clean, renewable energy. And they've generally looked to wind energy to really fulfill that need. So we measure this demand in a couple different ways. One of the most interesting is to look at power purchase agreements. These are the actual contracts for the power. In 2019 set a new record for wind power purchase agreements. We saw nearly 9 gigawatts of new agreements signed or announced in 2019, which is a pretty big uptick from previous years. And that includes a new record set by utilities with contracts for more than 5 gigawatts of new wind energy in 2019. In addition, those C&I customers that I mentioned have increasingly come to the table. We've actually saw 16 brand new C&I customers buy wind for the first time in 2019. And I think in total, we're just short of 150 different C&I customers that have signed a power purchase agreement for wind. So we're seeing strong demand both from the utility side of things as well as that non-utility side. All right, jumping to the next slide, I want to highlight some of the great impacts that the wind industry is having across the country. first, in terms of supply chain, there are over 500 wind-related manufacturing facilities across the country that are employing more than 25,000 folks. And importantly, a lot of this manufacturing activity is in places where you don't typically see a ton of wind development. So for example, there are over 100 different facilities in the Southeast that make parts and components for the U.S. wind industry and deliver them to those projects across the country. So great to see that. As well, economic impact. As an industry, we're investing between $10 and $15 billion a year in wind projects across the country. And that has generated tremendous benefits to communities and the economy to the tune of over 114,000 direct jobs. And many of those are happening in rural communities. So we're a big partner in the economic growth story across the country. All right, jump into the next slide. I want to hit on, again, some of those demand drivers, cost being one of them. The cost of wind energy has fallen 70% since 2009. And in many parts of the country, wind is the cheapest form of new generation available. We're also starting to see that wind is now competitive with existing resources in many parts of the country, which means it's now cheaper to build a new wind project than it is to continue to operate an existing conventional power plant. So certainly price and cost is an important factor here. Jumping to the next slide, renewable portfolio standards are one of those key policy drivers for the industry. These are standards at the state level that require a certain percentage of electricity to be driven from clean energy or renewable energy. And wind or utilities have responded to these targets, and wind has been a top choice in complying with those renewable portfolio standards. And we're seeing interest from states grow in increasing these RPSs to higher level targets. And then finally, I just want to highlight on the last slide here, one of the sort of key infrastructure needs that the industry has, and that's transmission. Transmission is really key to enable the delivery of this low-cost clean energy from those strong wind resource-rich areas to load centers across the country. And generally, we've kind of failed as a nation to invest as needed in transmission infrastructure to really enable this future. There are a few good case studies where this has gone well. Down in Texas, they've built out an incredible amount of transmission over the last couple of years that's enabled a lot of wind to be delivered to that market, as well as up in MISO and SPP. However, much more needs to be done on this front in order to continue delivering this low-cost form of energy to demand centers across the country. And with that, I think my time's up, so I'll stop there, and thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic and gives us a really great overview of what's happening in wind energy, and also gives a lot of thought about potential job opportunities for people like the students here at the school. Before I turn you over to the Solar Energy Industries Association and Shawn, I just want to suggest to everyone that you can leave questions in the chat box, and we strongly encourage your questions. Any ones that we are able to get around to at the end of the presentations, we will, and anyone we will forward on to the speakers so that they can provide us with some answers, as they are fit and able to based on their time. So that and in addition, all of these slides will be publicly available on the CBAE website. So Shawn, why don't you take it away?
Great, thank you, Kevin, and thank you very much for the invite. And you can go right ahead to the next slide if you'd like. Thank you. So as Kevin said, my name is Shawn Rumery. I'm Director of Research for the Solar Energy Industries Association. We're really AWEA's counterpart, but in the solar space. So we're a 501c6, which means that we advocate for the solar energy industry in Washington, D.C. and in state governments across the country. We have over 1,000 member companies across all 50 states, and you see some of our job members there, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Let's go to the next slide. So much like John presented, this presentation is going to move into a similar format. So let's give the broad view of where the solar energy industry has come, and I'll conclude where we're likely to be going. So a difference between solar and wind is that in the solar space, we have a large distributed solar market. And by distributed solar market, I mean primarily rooftop solar installations that you'll see on the roofs of homes and businesses. If it's an installation on a home, we refer to it as the residential market. If it's on a business, it's in the non-residential or commercial space. That represents in any given year around 30 to 35% of the industry. The rest of the industry, the balance of the industry, is made up of what are known as utility scale solar PV installations. And these are very large scale installations, typically out in a field or in a desert, that generally 1 megawatt and above. And really, when we talk about the solar market as a whole, you're really talking about 3 different market segments, and there's different drivers for each of those segments. And so I'll try to get into some of those as we move along here. In contrast to the wind market, solar is a somewhat newer industry. The first solar panels were made commercially available in the 70s. But the market really for solar photovoltaic electricity didn't really start taking off until the latter part of the early 2000s. As you can see from the chart here, we didn't actually hit a gigawatt in annual installations until 2011. And so, but since then, the market has moved very quickly, in no small part due to the investment tax credit, which I can see here highlighted. It's referred to as the ITC in the industry. And you can see how rapidly that growth has occurred. The industry has experienced an average annual growth rate of over 50% over the past several years. We now have over 70 gigawatts in installations across the country. That's enough, that those 70 gigawatts generate enough electricity to power over 13.5 million homes and offsets 81 million metric tons of CO2 each year, which is equivalent to taking 17.2 million cars off the road. Next slide, please. And so just to put this growth in context, each of the past 5 years, and once the 2019 numbers are totally final, it will be 6 years, solar has ranked first or second, in each of the last 6 years, and it will soon be 7 years, solar is ranked first or second in new electricity capacity added to the grid. So even though the industry didn't really get moving until really 2008, 2009, over the past several years, it's really taken off. In 2016, we added more capacity than any other electricity source in the country. And the early numbers that we've seen from 2019 suggest that we're likely to be on top in 2019 again. The total generation from the industry is about 2.5% of total electricity in the US. But again, this has grown pretty fast. Back in 2010, we only represented 0.1% of all electricity generation. Next slide, please. So this growth has really been led by the rapidly declining price of solar energy across the country. And this is really across all fronts. Certainly the hardware prices have come down, module prices especially, which make up the largest share of the hardware costs. We've also seen rapid declines in what we call soft costs, which are the non-hardware costs associated with the installation. And so over the past decade, prices have dropped by 70% over that time period. To put that in context, for a residential installation, back in 2010, a 5 kilowatt system was going to run you about $45,000. Today, before any incentives are taken, that same 5 kilowatt installation is going to be closer to $15,000. And so you can see how dramatically prices have come down. Next slide, please. And John actually already presented a little bit of this data, but just in a new chart here, you can see that the 3 lowest cost resources right now are utility scale PV, wind, and natural gas combined cycle. And it's no surprise that in the chart I showed previously, those are really the 3 sources that you see adding new capacity to the grid. Now, on the far left of this chart, you see residential rooftop PV and C&I rooftop PV at a relatively higher level than utility scale PV, wind, and natural gas. And that's because utility scale PV, wind, and natural gas compete on what's known as the wholesale power market, whereas residential and commercial PV compete on the retail electricity market, which in that market prices are higher. the retail market is essentially what you pay at the household level for electricity, right? And so they don't need to compete at the wholesale level for those resources. So in most markets around the country, utility scale PV along with wind are the two lowest cost electricity options that you can see. But in more and more markets, both residential PV and C&I rooftop PV are more than competitive and are good options for consumers. Next slide, please. And so this growth in the industry has obviously led to job growth. There's 242,000 jobs in the solar energy industry as of the end of 2018. There's new job numbers coming out very soon for 2019 that we're pretty optimistic about. But again, along with the growth of the industry, the jobs are growing here rapidly. From an economic perspective, the solar energy industry generates about $17 billion in economic activity every year. Next slide, please. The solar market is in all 50 states. The distributed component of the industry means that even if your state isn't a big player in the wholesale market, there's plenty of opportunities for individuals to install solar on their home. And so really the dominant player in the market for many years now has been California, and that continues to be the case. They just really hit the sweet spot in terms of solar resource and then solid state level policy, both for utility scale installations and for distributed installations. But we do see other markets growing very rapidly as the price of solar has come down. Utility scale markets, particularly in Texas and Florida, have really taken off in recent years, and we see extensive development there to the point where those two markets are likely to either match or overtake California as the top utility scale solar market in the very near future. In the Northeast, it's less a focus on utility scale installations and more focus on distributed installations, so smaller residential and commercial installations, which makes a lot of sense in those markets because they're more densely packed and there's less availability for utility scale solar and many more rooftops that seem to benefit from solar. Also in the Northeast, electricity prices are somewhat higher than in many other parts of the country, which makes solar a better option and a more competitive option in those markets. Going forward, what we expect is that the market is going to continue to diversify outside California. And as the prices continue to come down, more marginal markets, including many markets that are largely out of bounds for solar right now, are going to open up and become great opportunities for growth in the industry. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so wrapping things up here and starting to look forward, as I mentioned, we do expect extensive growth going forward. So in 2019, when the final numbers are all tabulated, we're expecting over 13 gigawatts of installations, which will make it the second largest year on record. And we expect that growth to continue in 2020 and into 2021, breaking annual records set previously in 2016. That growth occurs across all market segments, but especially in the utility scale space. In 2019, we're seeing record activity in new contracted projects. Over 15 gigawatts of new utility scale projects were contracted in 19, bringing the contracted pipeline to 40 gigawatts of utility scale projects. Those projects are all likely to come online definitely before 2023 and sometime before that in all likelihood. But we're also seeing continued growth in the residential space as prices continue to come down. Now, coloring a lot of this growth are two major policy interventions that are impacting the market. The first I mentioned briefly previously, which is the investment tax credit, or ITC. This is a 30% tax credit on the completed solar installation, and it applies to both distributed markets and utility scale markets. This credit was at 30% through the end of 2019. In 2020, it drops to 26%. In 2021, it drops to 22%. And then in 2022, it expires for customer-owned residential systems and then drops to 10% for all other installations. So this is creating some demand pull-in. There's a unique part of the investment tax credit which allows you to extend the time period in which you can claim the tax credit based on when you start construction. And so there are some projects which might not ultimately get connected until 2022 or even 2023 that will still be able to claim the tax credit, which reduces some of the demand pull-in that we're seeing in the near term. The other big kind of federal policy thing coloring the market right now is a tariff on imported solar panels. Every solar panel imported into the country is currently subject to a tariff in place by the Trump administration a couple of years ago. That tariff is stepping down by 5 percentage points each year and expiring entirely, if all goes well, at the end of 2021, at which point we expect the price of solar to come down a little bit more dramatically just because the tariff will be removed on the panels. Right now, that tariff is adding anywhere from 8 to 12 cents per watt to total system cost, which is increasing the ultimate cost to consumers and ultimately slowing demand. So we look forward to those tariffs going away, which we think is going to help drive growth as the costs come down, even as the IT starts to go away. And so that's why we are projecting growth even past expiration of the investment tax credit in 2021. Last slide, please. And I don't have time to get into all these things. We need to move on to the next speaker here, but I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the challenges and opportunities that we're thinking about going forward. I've already talked about trade policy and the ITC, but we're also concerned about consumer protection issues, particularly in the residential space. There's a lot of business to consumer direct marketing that goes on in this space, and the industry is really only as good as our companies. And so as the trade association, we're really making sure that our companies are following sound business practices there. On the opportunity side, some things to highlight that I didn't really get into are the corporate demand. Much like John mentioned with wind, solar is experiencing the same bump with many corporate clients moving into this space. I mentioned 15 gigawatts of new contracted utility scale solar in 2019. About 20% of that demand is coming from the corporate side, which is significant. The other big move that we're seeing here in the solar space is what we're referring to as the solar plus market. And so as the price of battery storage comes down, the pairing of solar plus battery storage really makes particularly utility scale solar a great option for utilities whose customers are very interested in solar, but the utility might be a little concerned about the fact that solar goes offline at night. And as we see more growth in EVs and just greater electrification there, we're expecting a lot more demand for solar in that front as well. So I will go ahead and stop there. And thanks again, Kevin, for the opportunity. And I look forward to taking questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Shawn. And speaking of questions, I do want to encourage everyone to put questions into the chat box, and we would love to take them on, assuming we have some time at the end. Moving on to energy efficiency, it's been great to hear about wind and solar. I think efficiency sometimes gets short shrift in the overall equation, but as I think you're about to hear, it's pretty important for the entire mix. So, Pat Stanton.
Great, thank you. I am Pat Stanton, Director of Policy at E for the Future, and we are, next slide please, we're a 501c3. We advocate for energy efficiency and as a major part of the solution for climate change and improving the economy. Next slide. So today I want to talk a little bit about what energy efficiency jobs are, because it's kind of easy to think about what solar and wind involves, but energy efficiency is sometimes a little under the radar. I'll talk about a couple of the drivers, how EE is fundamental to clean energy solutions, and a few things about careers. So next slide. I'm sure some of you are sitting there thinking, man, I don't want to crawl around attics, install insulation. Why would I want to be involved in energy efficiency? And I think it's really important to understand the scale and scope of energy efficiency jobs and industry. Next slide. So the U.S. Energy and Employment Report that Sandy will be talking about in more detail later has shows that of the traditional energy sectors, energy efficiency is by far the largest. It's also the fastest growing. And I'm really here to make a pitch for you to consider it as a career, because most of the employers that are interviewed as part of this major research effort every year, most of the employers in energy efficiency are desperately looking for workers. So think of energy efficiency. I'll start with buildings. Energy efficiency in buildings starts with, is what we call the shell of the building tight? Can it be made more tight, and can the ventilation systems be improved? Then there's all the mechanicals, your HVAC. If you're a C&I building, there may be chillers, refrigeration, various kinds of either heating water, cooling water. And then there's all the things we plug in and turn on and off as we use our buildings. So there's lots of different ways we consume energy in buildings, and therefore lots of different ways we can waste energy in buildings, and lots of different ways that we can improve the energy efficiency of buildings. Next slide, please. So we do, E4 with our partner E2 does an EE Jobs in America report, which is a deeper dive on the data from the user research. And one of the things you can see here in the top graph is that most of the energy efficiency jobs are related to construction, manufacturing, wholesale trade, professional services are also significant, especially when you consider the size of the pie. This is almost 10 times more jobs than the jobs in either wind or solar. So it's a big sector. And the actual number of workers that are doing hands-on installation or repair in the lower graph here, the red section, it's about a third of the jobs. So most of the jobs are not actually constructing things. They may be manufacturing products. They may be doing administration and management and sales, a lot of high-tech computer programming at this point to better run and connect all of the different things that we are using in our buildings and outside in our property. So next slide, please. Another thing is that energy efficiency professionals are everywhere and do all kinds of things. And so we started at E4 the energy Faces of Energy Efficiency initiative, where we've interviewed and collected information from more than 1,200 professionals in energy efficiency around the country. They're in every state and work in all kinds of fields. There's architects, there's bankers, there are people who do financing, there are people who manage software platforms. And so if you're interested in potentially having an informational interview with somebody, you can contact me and I can see if I can come up with a match. Next slide. So energy efficiency is a lot of small businesses in almost every county in the country, but it's also a lot of big companies, names that you would recognize that work not only in the US, but multinational situations. So energy efficiency opportunities for careers exist in large companies as well as small. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk about the drivers, policy drivers that really impact energy efficiency. So climate is really a huge driving force for the action to reduce emissions. And there are more and more states around the country that have set targets to have either 100% renewable, 100% carbon-free energy by some certain date. As those policies gear up, there's going to be the question of what to, how to invest to achieve that goal. And energy efficiency will be a big part of that solution. Next driver. Next slide, please. So social determinants of health is a really emerging field in the health area where people realize that, where health professionals are realizing that for certain kinds of chronic conditions, the environment where patients spend a lot of their time, whether it's their school or their home or their office, have an impact on their health. And it turns out that a lot of the kinds of fixes to those buildings that can improve people's health are the same fixes that energy efficiency would create. Similarly, if the problem isn't in the building, but just the air, and that you have areas of high smog that create real problems for asthma or that kind of thing, then people, certainly energy efficiency can be a very cost-effective way to reduce those emissions. Next slide. And finally, finance and risk. I don't know how many of you have followed what was going on in Davos this year, but it was pretty interesting. The World Economic Forum does a big survey prior to each Davos meeting where they ask economic experts from all over the world what they consider the most important risks facing financial sector over the next year. And for the first time ever in 2020, the top 5 risks identified were all related to climate. So, well, there are leaders and laggards in the public policy arena with regard to addressing climate risks. Certainly the recognition that there's significant financial risks and opportunities has become more of a focus of the financial industry. BlackRock, which is the largest asset manager in the world, made a big announcement as part of the Davos event too, that they are changing their focus to be looking at energy, at climate as central to their investing strategy. And they've asked all of the companies they invest in, which is like 25% of the companies in the United States, to file voluntary climate risk and climate impact statements by the end of this year. And they've also BlackRock has taken a very proactive effort to put together an investment fund strictly targeted to making investments in clean energy, including energy efficiency in Asia, Africa, and South America. So we're seeing a big change in the financial world. Next slide. So we've heard great from both Shawn and John about the wind industry and the solar industry and the storage component of that. And I think this slide is really helpful to understand how wind solar storage, represented here as the light blue line with the WSS title, and energy efficiency, which would be a portfolio of wind solar storage plus energy efficiency. So this was a study done by the Rocky Mountain Institute, and it looked at how quickly and at what price could these two scenarios replace all of the services and all of the reliability of proposed new natural gas plants. And click, please. So here is where the wind, solar, and storage line intersects with the cost to build a new natural gas plant. So that's 2030. Next click. However, today, if you build a portfolio which has about 10 to 15, depending on the state, but 10 to 15% of the total portfolio of investment in energy efficiency, the rest in wind, solar, and storage, you can create a portfolio that is economically producing all of the same services as a proposed new natural gas plant today. So that's 10 years earlier. And next click. And the next click. So you can see here where the wind, solar, and storage line, or the comprehensive new portfolio standard, new portfolio cross the line of replacing existing natural gas operations. So again, a good 10 years earlier. And so it's possible to build new clean generation to operate all of our existing buildings and the new transport that we're going to be putting on and electrifying without cutting the waste in the system, but it isn't really economically sound or time-wise a sound strategy. Next slide. So finally, one of the things I like to when I'm talking to folks about careers is to say, you know, when was the last time you got totally lost in your work and time just flew by? So you have skills and competencies, but which are the ones that you really enjoy using? And one of the things that's wonderful about energy efficiency careers is they're everywhere. Location is not a constraint. All kinds of skills and competencies can contribute to using less energy to get the same value, the same lights, the same sound that we get today. Compensation tends to be very good because having special expertise in how to do the same thing using less energy is a real valued skill, and salaries tend to be higher. And there's huge, huge future potential. There are millions of buildings in this country that are over 20 years old that will need to be upgraded if we hope to achieve our clean energy goals at a reasonable price. So with that, I'll turn it back to Kevin.
Pat, thank you so much. I think it's been great to see how these things are all building on each other towards a strategy that can involve clean energy generation from different sources, efficiency, putting them together into a total portfolio. And we're going to finish our webinar today by looking at energy and employment trends from the 2019 U.S. Energy and Employment Report, but also thinking about the role of state governments and state energy officials. Take it away.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. Hello, everyone, and thanks to the team at Yale for the opportunity to chat with you all today. My name is Sandy Fazeli. I'm the Managing Director of Policy at the National Association of State Energy Officials, or NASEO, which is the membership association representing the governor-designated state and territory energy agency directors across the U.S. NASEO is one of the 3 organizations producing the U.S. Energy and Employment Report, an annual report, along with Energy Futures Initiative and BW Research Partnership. So today I'll be talking a little bit about key findings from our most recent report, the 2019 Employment Report, and some trends that we're seeing at the state level pertaining to energy policy and employment and workforce impacts. So on the next slide, by way of background, the U.S. Energy and Employment Report was first developed at the U.S. Department of Energy in 2015 with review and approval by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They issued the report twice in 2016 and 2017 and used a nationwide survey to produce the analysis. However, in late 2017, we learned that DOE would not be continuing the survey or producing an analysis for the coming year. So NASIO and EFI announced an effort to do it on our own. And we've been involved ever since, and we are coming out with the 2020 report in the next several weeks. So I encourage you all to stay tuned. So this slide includes the logos of the diverse organizations that have supported the U.S. Energy and Employment Report since DOE opted not to issue it. They include philanthropic foundations, several state energy offices, as well as business and industry associations and nonprofits like E4 and the Solar Foundation. These are our 2019 sponsors, but I should note that for our 2020 report coming out next month, we're really thrilled that we can add AWEA's logo to this slide. So we're very thankful to Pat, John, and others for having invested in this project and making sure that the important data collection continued even after the federal government opted not to participate. On the next slide, I'll move on to some of the good stuff, some findings from last year's report. So actually we can skip over to the next slide. One of the top lines for me, having been involved in the employment report for the past 3 years now, is that the U.S. energy workforce is growing. It's an important part of the U.S. economy and the workforce as a whole. And not only is it growing, but it is adding jobs at a faster rate than the rest of the U.S. workforce. From 2015 to 2016, energy employment increased by almost 5%, roughly 14% of all new jobs created in the country. 2016 to 17, we added 133,000 net new jobs, nearly 7% of all new jobs nationwide. And in 2017 to 2018, energy jobs in the U.S. increased by 2.3%, representing nearly 7% of all new jobs nationwide. Next slide, please. However, not every sector in the energy economy has experienced steady growth. This slide shows the breakdown by the 5 sectors that we include in our survey and analysis. Fuels, which had an uptick last year, as well as transmission, distribution, and storage, energy efficiency, and motor vehicles, which have experienced growth. But something that I find noteworthy is the decline in electric power generation employment, whereas all the other sectors have experienced fairly steady employment increases. It declined by just under 1%, losing about 8,300 jobs. And job losses in solar, nuclear, and coal generation were partially offset by gains in natural gas, wind, and CHP. And it remains to be seen whether these trends continue through 2019. So again, I encourage you all to stay tuned for our 2020 analysis, which will be released in late March. Next slide. Our analysis also uncovered some interesting data points when it comes to the demographic composition of the energy workforce. Many energy sectors are now racially more diverse than the workforce as a whole. For Latino and Hispanic representation, Black and African American representation, and those with 2 or more races. And interestingly, electric power generation is the most diverse sector, with 31% of the workforce composed of people of color. Unfortunately, on gender diversity, there's still a lot more work to do. Women make up just about 23 to 32% of the various energy sectors that we surveyed, compared to 47% of the overall workforce. Veterans comprise about 9 to 11% of employees, compared to 6% nationally, so doing pretty well there. And then unionization rates tend to be higher than the national rate in the energy sector. Next slide, please. This slide synthesizes some of our key findings further. I won't walk through everything, but I think that there are a few noteworthy items. First of all told, low carbon emissions energy, both in terms of energy that contributes to electric power generation, but also in terms of fuels production, employs 800,000 Americans. So what I think this tells us is that clean energy is no longer a niche. It is a strong presence in our economy, tightly tied to state policy and utility investment strategies, and also a source of good wages, job security, and income. Second, reemphasizing Pat's message, energy efficiency is a really important source of jobs. The energy efficiency sector has added nearly 275,000 new workers in 3 years, and it's intricately tied to the construction industry. Of the 7.1 million construction workers in the US, nearly 1.3 million of them are energy efficiency workers. Third, for the most part, energy sector firms and employers are projecting more growth in future years. They reported 4.6% estimates in growth for 2019. And again, our upcoming report will either corroborate or deny that. And then finally, despite the growth projections, almost 77% of all surveyed employers reported difficulty hiring qualified workers. The largest pain points were in energy efficiency construction jobs, professional and business services, and battery storage. So we're really seeing a discrepancy in the growth in the industry and the workforce versus difficulty finding qualified workers. Next slide, please. So at NASEO, we care very much about data, not just for data's sake, but for the role it plays in informed policymaking and decision-making. And since economic development represents a critical part of the State Energy Office's mission, I thought I'd end my talk by highlighting the relationship between state policymaking and energy sector employment. So as you can see on this slide, in the past few years, we've seen some massive announcements at the state and local level in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets, clean energy and electricity goals, and energy efficiency standards. Just to name a few, in Minnesota, Xcel announced a goal to be carbon-free by 2050. In Nevada, they've got a 50% renewables plan by 2030 and a goal to go 100% carbon-free by 2050. In Washington state, they have a 100% clean electricity goal by 2045. And the US Climate Alliance now has over 25 governors signing on to commit to the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. But of course, there is more to state policy than energy efficiency, renewable energy, and climate targets. Target setting is only one piece of the puzzle. So even if you live in or come from a state that doesn't have a green highlight on this map, there are programs and initiatives all over the country that are helping move the needle and in turn attract talent, shape the workforce, and drive private sector investment in energy products and technologies. For instance, innovative financing programs are deploying private and utility capital into energy efficiency and renewable energy projects. There are new ways to incentivize clean energy investment through standards, advanced rate making, procurement. Many states are supporting STEM education and technology innovation to attract talent and job placement in certain regions, markets, and states. And even in disaster rebuilding, which many of the state energy offices are in charge of overseeing, there is an unfortunate but huge opportunity in disaster-affected areas to rebuild smarter, more efficient, and more durable. And what this means is potentially new workers, new jobs, and new opportunities all across the country. The next slide, please. And finally, there's a growing policy priority undergirding almost any state policy or program effort, and that is equity, access, and inclusion. How do you ensure that the investments that are coming online in clean energy benefit everybody, particularly vulnerable, disadvantaged, and frontline communities? One answer is through inclusive workforce development and employment policies and programs. So last year, we had the opportunity to conduct an assessment for the city of Minneapolis with a particular focus on how the city can advance inclusionary policies that diversify its workforce, expand access for underserved residents. This graph shows the uneven distribution of unemployment in the city when you break it down by race and ethnicity. Average unemployment in the city is 6%, not terrible, but it's distinctly higher for African American and American Indian or Indigenous workers. In our study, we also found that there were pockets of high unemployment in the city, particularly aligned with lower income and minority neighborhoods. And I think if we were to recreate this graph for any state or locality, it would yield similar results, that there are residents who can be brought into the clean energy conversation and contribute to a strong, qualified, and growing workforce. This is especially important as we face the climate crisis, transition to a different energy economy, and want to bring in a tide that raises all boats rather than just the wealthy few or the early adopters. So next slide, I'll leave it at that. Here's my contact information along with others on the U.S. Energy and Employment Report team. So thanks for your attention, and please don't hesitate to send questions or contact us if you'd like to learn more.
Thank you so much to all of you. We are exactly at 1 o'clock. So although on one hand, I'm sorry that we don't have time for questions from the people around the country who are listening to this, I think I can speak for everybody that each of the 4 presentations was incredibly thorough and hit exactly the points that we asked you to talk about. We will be posting this on the Center for Business and the Environment at Yale website, and also linking to it through the website of the Career Development Office at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. I want to thank our speakers. Thanks so much for everything you've done. I want to thank everybody who participated and stuck in. Almost everybody stayed the whole time, and we are at 1 o'clock, so that means it's time to say farewell and goodbye and thank you.
Thank you.